think it's recording. Yeah. And last week, I also hope it was useful having Ansar Siddiqui come on for his virtual class. I just thought it was crazy that he could do all that with COVID that early in the morning. I'm really not sure I could have done that. But it's something that I've also learned about aid workers, that we never seem to stop, or we never seem to have any bad hours to do work. You know, I was trying to be polite and say, are you sure? Is that something you can do? Oh, I'm up all the time at that time doing conference calls. And so, again, it's something probably you'll learn as you go, if you go into this sector, that it's a 24/7 kind of job. It's certainly more of a career than a job, I would say. It's definitely not 9 to 5. Anyway, his insight and his personal experience, I think, opened up some really key aspects of project management. And particularly, he started introducing intentionally the project cycle, the life cycle, and how knowledge management fits into that. So I think some of you, what I saw, had also fit a little bit of that into your first assignment too. So I was really, really happy to see that. And I'm going to be sending you out, just as a kind of as an announcement, I'm going to be sending you out a survey pretty soon, because we are heading into reading week next week. And then we have the midterm, and then we start the second half. The survey is really going to just help me, as I said earlier, just to recalibrate the course for the second half of the semester. And I do plan to bring in a speaker from the Government of Canada who works on the Haiti desk. So I think his perspective is going to be really interesting from the point of view of a donor. So I'm going to try and give you sort of all those different perspectives, and he'll be talking about how he does program portfolio management and how they conduct project management and what they expect of their implementing partners as well. So I think we'll get a really rich conversation out of that. And I will be bringing in somebody for communications as well. That's something I'll talk a little bit about later on this evening, but it's something that's super important in terms of building those relationships with your donors and with the stakeholders. So your communication staff are really important. And this fellow's been a communications director for a lot of years, particularly in Africa. So he'll be able to bring a field perspective to his talk. So for tonight, my thinking is that now that we've had 4 classes on different aspects and general frameworks of project management, to me, that's sort of a backdrop, if you like, or a backdrop context of the environment you might find yourself in one day. We're now familiar enough, I hope, to start addressing the project lifecycle or management lifecycle head on. So I would say this part of the course is pretty vital to understanding the nature of projects and how to manage them. And as you saw last week, it's a chronological thing. And you'll need to have a good grasp of the terms and of the process itself. And where I've been saying in previous classes that we tend not to use a lot of the formalized project management terms and methods, we do use the project management cycle a great deal. And so this is what I'm going to be going over this evening. And it's going to be also, just so you know, it's part of the midterm exam as well. So this is pretty critical, this lecture. So you'll recognize this. These are the terms from our previous classes. And I intentionally put them out there at the start of our course just so that you heard them. So in the first couple of lessons that we did, I just wanted you to sort of get a grasp of them, get a feel for them, a glimpse of what they represent. Because in a good learning process, this is sort of my style, it's always easier to be exposed to terms and definitions early on and then to address them in detail later on, rather than diving straight into them. So I always go back to the master of rhetoric, if you know who that is. That's Aristotle himself, right? The master of rhetoric. And he described that when you talk to people or class, you need to tell people what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So I try to do that if I can. So tell people what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So it's kind of a threefold discussion. And that's a good way to sort of build that memory and also become familiar. And it's like visualization. If you look at Olympic swimmers and that sort of thing, when they do their training, it's not just physical, it's also mental. So they're going through the whole routine of their trials in their mind so that when they actually do it, they feel like they've already done it before. So it's the same sort of thing when we're doing classwork. So you'll remember that in these 5 cycles, you remember that I said I would be including a 5th phase because I initially gave you 4. And the 5th one is the performance and control. So we're going to add that in today. I know Iqbal last week, he also talked about it. And it refers back to what we discussed with our 2 previous lessons. And we heard how it's not a policing function. Rather, it's a way to collect data and information and be formative in how we make decisions to manage a project and to report on its results. So you won't see that phase, performance and control, in every diagram if you do a Google and try and look it up online. But certainly it's an important one in our field of development. So I'm putting it in there so you become familiar with it. And keep in mind also, if you do go on Google, just be really, really careful at all of the diagrams that people put up there. I keep saying, always refer to the PMI or the PMBOK, that big book, to find the standard if you have any doubts. That way you can't drift too far off course. So terms like, just to give you an example, initiation, okay, so that's that first one there. They're also sometimes confused with planning. And I've seen some, when I Google the diagrams, I see some that merge it with the planning as well. Execution is sometimes substituted with the word implementation. And these are technically different terms, but it really comes down to an English language issue. I think when they say execution, they mean implementation because that's how they describe it. But just be aware that there are nuances in how those are described online. So just, like anything on Google, just be really careful. So use the PMBOK as your guide and also familiarize yourself with the details of each phase. And I'm going to go through them this evening. And then you can really glide past the different labels that people put on things. Once you're really comfortable with it, you'll see those mislabels and then you'll understand what the issue was. More important is to understand what the phase is about. So we'll go into detail on that. So let's go back to the start of our journey, just as a refresher. And this is I'll give you the sort of simplified life cycle of a project. In its most simplistic form, the project, and we described it earlier, is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. It's agreed, planned, and executed to achieve a specific goal through a series of interrelated tasks, okay? So you just commit that to memory, not word for word, but just make sure you understand what the content is that it's talking about. So in our visual, it's the various inputs made in a project, and that can be the materials, the money, your time, all of these things, which is then utilized or spent over a specific timeline, which is finite, which then results in some immediate output, or let's say a tangible result. And by that, I mean something, you can measure right away, or something that you can touch, something tangible. And these are clearly laid out in your indicators, which we were talking about last week. So very simply, something goes into the project and something is produced by the project, but it's done in a very set time period. All right, I'm really dumbing it down here, but you get the idea. Now, I've mentioned before also that it gets a little confusing in international development if we stick to the definition rigidly. And that's because there are now numerous long-term results or outcomes that don't materialize with the timeline of the approved project. And we talked a little bit about that as well. So instead then, you have to build certain assumptions into your planning that is going to provide enough evidence to assume that certain outcomes will take place. Or maybe another alternative is you undertake a post-evaluation. And sometimes that can happen 1 to 2 years after a project is closed. And that way you can assess the long-term results from the project. The reason we do that is because there is a behavioral change that takes place in a project, not just the tangible results. And they don't happen often for a good 2 to 3 years after an activity has taken place. And some of you put this into your concept note as well, which was great. It's really hard to assess some of these things during the project's life cycle because you can't see the behavioral change of the community. But you can put some indicators that will point towards that success and give you a fair compass. And we're going to be discussing this after reading week when we get into the design of the logic model. And I'll take you through the results chain so that you can see how we build up a convincing case that will then predict what some of those long-term results might look like. So as a really quick summary, the immediate outcome on our illustration is something that results from your outputs, okay? And it's usually immediate, as the name implies, and it's observed during the life cycle of the project that you're implementing. So an example would be, I think we used this last time, you develop a curriculum, and that's an activity. So designing the curriculum is actually something you're doing, so it's an activity. And it's also an output, because that's the physical document that you've produced once you have your curriculum. It's something that you hand over. So it's an activity and an output. An output is, after all, a completed activity. So the wording is almost identical. When you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to create a curriculum, the output is going to be the curriculum is created. Okay, so it's almost an identical wording, but one is a finished product. So all of these activities so far have occurred within the life cycle of the project. So you created your training curriculum, that's the activity output. You delivered your training, and that's a planned output. And the students had access to, and they hopefully gained knowledge on a particular subject. Now we're talking about your immediate outcome. So that's something that happened as a result of the output that you created. And to measure that, we talked last week, one of the options of doing a measurement would be to do a pre and post test. So the students come in, you test their knowledge, the students take the course, then as they go out, you test them again and you see if there was an improvement in their knowledge score. So that's a very simple way to actually do it. So this is our base, or you say our foundation that we need to understand. So I'll just pause just for a second just to make sure that that's clear, because you kind of need that as we start building on to the next sections of this. So is that pretty straightforward, or do you have any questions? Yeah, we're good? Okay. So we get to the last segment of this illustration, and this is the longer term outcome, or what we'll be later calling the intermediate outcome. So we had our output, immediate outcome, intermediate outcome. And this is still part of our project, but it doesn't fit within the rigid definition of a project. You remember how we defined it? We said projects are always finite, but in this case, project closed, but there's something still happening. So it doesn't quite fit within that definition. But you'll find most development projects now will have this section in the results framework, this longer term objective. And it's almost always behavioral change, I would say, in the way people do something or in the way people use the outputs of the project. So that's normally the case. So let me extend my example earlier of the training, and let's assume that the students who participated went on to use that training in other parts of their life. So maybe there was a water and sanitation training component on the use of soap for good hygiene practices. And one of our groups talked about this last week. If those students go home and practice washing their hands before eating, then you can say that there was an observed behavioral change as a result of the training in the project. All right. So that's pretty cool when you think about it. And it's the hope of all social initiatives, if you think, to achieve long-term behavioral change. So that would really be a great outcome. But the problem for a purist project manager, let's say, is that the project is no longer active when many of these changes become evident. It's already closed, the project closed. So how do we know that they went on to practice what they had learned? So a purist, for lack of a better word, might argue that this is not part of the project. It doesn't fit within the finite definition of a project. So there are ways that development practitioners can then get around it. So I'll just share that with you so you have a bit of a sense. One is we can define it as a program. It's kind of cheating a little bit. A program is larger than a project. So you might have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 projects. They would be classified together under this umbrella called a program. So a program is not a project. It can be a collection of projects. All right, so if you have a program portfolio, it's a collection of projects. Another way is to build a post-evaluation, which I mentioned earlier. and you build that into your project, and you come back in 2 to 3 years after it's being closed and you measure it, right? Some people do that. I've yet to see any donor that will fund it, to be honest. So people talk about it as a great idea, but I've rarely seen it in practice. So unless an agency who implemented is willing to do this themselves and pay for it out of their own pocket, they often don't happen in reality. So the more often what will happen if there's a continuing project in that area, or perhaps there's a need within that agency to do something similar, they might then go back and do a post evaluation, but they'll call it a baseline because they're now starting another project, and they'll measure that in their baseline at the same time just to get that information and share it with their donors. Sometimes it leverages their proposals when they're submitting them. A lot of times, like in the first example, agencies are going to blur the lines and they'll pay for it out of other pots of money, or they simply won't measure it at all and they'll just make assumptions about the change. So in most cases, I would say this is the most likely scenario, is that they'll just guess. So hopefully you've got a really, really strong logic model. And that brings me to the next way that we can get around this. The most common approach to dealing with this finite project issue and the longer term outcomes is to create a logic model. And these are always based on, or you hope, on scientific rigor and logical assumptions based on successful projects that have already been finished. So a logic model, and we'll be discussing this right after reading week in our next class, is a logical connection between the various results in your project. It's called a results chain. From the inputs to the activities, to the outputs, to the immediate and intermediate outcomes. All of that is called a result chain. And if you have built in the right assumptions, then you can then go on to complete your longer term outcome results statement. That'll give you more confidence that they'll be achieved in the long term. So to do this really well, you have to create a theory of change. And I always do this by first creating my logic model, and then I create a theory of change, which is just, if you've studied any sort of theory of change, you'll see that it follows more or less the same concept of a results chain. What will lead to what will lead to what to actually result in some kind of change. So this is one of the most critical parts, I would say, of proposal development. And one of our classes will be dedicated to learning how to do a really good proposal. And some of you have actually, I think, tried writing this in the assignment that you submitted when you were describing your solution. So it rationalizes how the funds will be spent and what outcomes you can expect. And that way, a donor can not only see the logical steps behind the project activities, but the donor can also assess if the money is going to be well spent. All right, so it's kind of creating a very convincing argument. So you create a set of assumptions and hypotheses, much like a thesis or a research project. And if you deliver on the outputs and your immediate outcomes, which usually happen as soon as the output is completed, they're almost like instantaneous, then your theory of change spells out the long-term trajectory that you are likely to observe from those. And if you're lucky, you've got a little bit longer period of time in your projects. You know, some projects are 4 to 5 years, and you can actually observe some of the changes that are taking place. Because again, it takes 2 to 3 years for some of these behavioral aspects to actually materialize. So 4 to 5 year project, by your second year, you might actually be lucky enough to see some changes before you get to the end of your project. Okay, so I want to do a really short exercise. There's only 3 of you on here, so I'm going to just throw you all into the same room. But what I want to do is just to reinforce the point and ensure that you've really understood the basic elements so far, because as we go further, we got to sort of build on all this. So I want to just get you into these rooms just for about 10 minutes. And I'm going to give you a basic scenario and ask that you work with your partners to fill in the template that I'm going to give you now. So really easy. You can just use a pencil and paper and just recreate the template quickly. Then come back and just one of you report on what you decided within your group, okay? And it's going to be this one here. Okay, so really simple. Just what we've basically just been talking about: inputs, outputs, immediate outcomes, and intermediate or longer term outcomes. Okay, so I'm gonna send you into the room there, and I want you to just look at the scenario that I've provided. You've been asked to build a well. The donor is concerned about the village having access to clean water, but the donor also knows that this can also reduce, or the community knows this can reduce disease transmission by having people maintain better hygiene. So what would your inputs, outputs, and outcomes for the project look like? All right. So really simple. I think I mentioned in my group that this sector is probably one of the easiest ones to do it. So we'll just keep it simple. And I'm going to send you to a room if I can do it. Okay, I'll just send you guys for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and you can share that with me. I don't think you're in the room, are you? Oh, there you go. That's okay. There we go.
Sorry about that. I think I accidentally left the class. Oops. All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Dr. Tanner, I don't know if we can hear you.
You might be on mute. It might have done that switching thing again.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, we can hear you.
I think it was the switching thing. Yeah.
No worries.
You got me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Just closing these rooms. Sorry, it's something weird going on.
Okay.
Hang on one sec here. I don't know why I created a room, to be honest. We didn't need it. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, so we first of all we kind of just discussed each of the four um, sub topics, however you want to call it, brackets.
Okay.
So we kind of discussed what, like, the input, what the output, what the immediate outcome, and what the longer term outcome would be before we just started putting, ideas.
Okay.
So we discussed that we thought the inputs for this case would be the materials for the well. So keeping in mind maybe using brick or concrete, some type of material that will be able to be long lasting and sustainable for the community that it's built in. We also said the actual tangible money for the well and the financial resources that it will take to build the well. So whether that comes from fundraising or, kind of a gift, maybe from an organization or a certain donor. And then we also said, as a group, the physical labor that it will take. So physical workers, whether it be workers from the organization, but then we also brought in the idea of having the community be a part of it, because all of us agree that participatory development is key, especially when building something as essential as a well. Building a well that will be able to accommodate to their needs specifically, keeping in mind that every community is different. So that's what we kind of said for inputs. And then we said for outputs, we said the actual well itself. The well that is working and the actual well that was built. Um, and then the water. And then for the immediate outcomes, we said access to the clean water. And then the long-term outcomes, we said, because it has to do with behavioral and sometimes non-tangible, we said better health sanitation, which also then would lead to the better hygiene, and then a reduction in disease, and it would be able to lead to a reduction in the disease, and then more control on different disease that happens. So
Fantastic. Wow.
kind of what we said as a group. Yeah.
Okay. I can skip that whole class then next semester. I can. You got it. Great. Okay, we're done.
Great.
No,
Now
thanks,
I
thanks
just
for
have
the-
a quick question
yeah.
myself. Just because I sometimes find I have a hard time in this case. I was thinking output, so obviously the output would be the actual well, but I wrote down that it would also be the clean water. But then for the immediate outcomes, I have access to clean water. So would it be right that I wrote for outputs that it's the well and the water, and then immediate outcomes access to the clean water, or is that?
It's actually a really good question, and I can't say I've ever heard anyone ask that.
I'm just I
So,
don't know what I mean. So
yeah, I know for sure that the well is an output. I've
okay,
not considered water as the output, but I don't see why you couldn't,
okay,
except that an output normally relates to something that you have linked back to your activity. So you can't link any activities to the water because the water is just there, right? It's
got
extent.
it. Okay,
So that normally wouldn't be part of your project, but if you had some kind of hydraulic system and you were creating water, yeah.
okay,
Putting oxygen and hydrogen together, that would work.
yes, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So a desalination plant, I'm just trying to think of an example, but that could be one, a desalination plant in Saudi Arabia. If they're actually creating water from salt water to clean water, that could be an output for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, well that's really great. And one in particular I'll point out is I'm really pleased to hear is that you considered the community's activities as part of your input, and that's something that's really ignored a lot in our sector. So I'm really glad that you included that, because it's not just what the donor gives you or what you put into it; it's what all your other stakeholders are putting into it as well. Those are inputs. So great. So I'm going to be going into this in much more detail when we start developing a logic model, and you'll get an idea of how to construct your results framework. But really, basically, you've got the general feel for it. So I'm really pleased about that. Now, what I want to do is I want to circle back to the triple constraint that we talked about. So another important element I introduced early on. And I just want to refresh ourselves on the elements of the triple constraint in a project. So does anyone want to take a stab at what those three elements are?
Scope, time, and oh shoot, money.
Yeah, cost. There you go, cost. But again, money is one element of many, right, that you were talking about. Perfect. Yeah, great. Okay, so time, cost, and scope. Yeah, commit that to memory because that's something definitely that's going to come up over and over, and I'll be explaining a little bit how these all fit together now. So time, the length of time to implement the project, the cost, and we just said the physical dollars, the money, but also the in-kind costs, and that can be from your stakeholders that Rebecca was talking about. And all of those should be able to be monetized. So whatever your inputs are into the project, you should at some point be able to monetize that. So in some cases, if a community is adding their labor, their local labor, like to build the bridge, I know some of you mentioned that in your assignment, then you would normally ask them to keep timesheets when they come to work. You would measure the number of hours that they're working. Then you would look at the country's standard for what they call their agricultural wage index, because they're rural communities. So you'd be looking at the agricultural index for that. Work out what the normal rate of pay is to a laborer. And then you would multiply that by the number of hours or days that they're working. That would then be monetized, and you would put that into your project as an in-kind contribution. So everything should really have a dollar sign attached to it if it's an input. And then of course we have scope, which is the deliverables you plan to have, and also where they're delivered. And I'm going to come back to that in a sec as we expand your last exercise just then. Okay, so in a lot of models, again, that you see online, you'll see that quality is often put into this model as well. So again, I'm just pointing these out to you. I know it's kind of repetitive, but when you go on Google, you'll see sometimes that they put quality at one of the points of the triangle. But the Project Management Institute defines quality as being always in the center, not on the points. And because really you're balancing these three factors throughout the life cycle of the project, and you'll ultimately be controlling the quality of your project in terms of, let's say, cost effectiveness. So where it's cost effectiveness, timeliness, where we're talking about time, and quality of deliverables or quality of scope. So quality, when you think of it that way, really belongs to each of the three elements in the triple constraint. And to be honest, it took me a while to figure out all the ins and outs of this because there are conflicting descriptions from different sectors and industries. If you look at international development, they describe it one way. If you go to, another sector, you'll see that they're describing it a different way. So sometimes keep in mind that the sector you're looking at may just have a different way of explaining it. But I'd always recommend you look at it this way because that will allow you to go across borders to pretty much any sector. So using a triangle to show the triple constraint, is really useful actually because we can visualize how one of the factors impacts on the other. So how you are to balance the three factors as there are changes in the project along the way, and you get a lot of changes. These actually happen quite frequently, more than you would like, because if you think, we're generally working in a very unpredictable environment, and I discussed a lot of that with you last week as well. So project managers have to be ready to adapt and change throughout the project lifecycle using all of those various tools and processes, but always keeping their eye on the three key elements of this triangle. So this would really be right front and center of your handbook. So I just want to do another really quick exercise with you, similar to the last one, actually following up from the last one. Let's say we've agreed to do our water well project in 3 villages in Uganda, okay? And you've already described how that logic model is going to look like. And we're going to build 1 well in each village, each of the 3 villages. And we've already agreed on our project plan with our donor, and so we have our charter, our agreement with the donor. Now, this also happens quite often. You're just about to get started, and then all of a sudden, one of the villages has decided that they don't want our agency building that well anymore. So basically, I've called you all together. You're my project team, because this represents, it's quite an urgent problem. It represents 30% of our project, and that also means 30% of our budget as well. So it's immediately impacting our cost and our scope in the triple constraint. And you can see that in the triangle at the bottom there. So I'd like you to go back into your group. This time I'm not going to send you to a round, I'm just going to shut off my video, and I promise not to listen. But I just want you to go back to your group and think about 3 things that you can do, just 3 things that you could do to solve this problem, and then come back and share with us what you share with me what you found. Okay, so just 3 things that you could do to solve this immediate problem. And I will see you.
Sorry, just to clarify, Village 1 doesn't want the well anymore?
Exactly. They don't want us building it. They don't want us building it. Yeah.
Oh, they don't want, so they want a well, they just don't want us building it.
Yeah, but the money is ours, right? And we had the money for those 3 villages.
Got it. Okay.
Now one of them is not going to be there. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want 3 different things that like work together, or 3 options?
3 options, because
Okay.
now you can imagine with this problem we have to go back to the donor and tell them, oops, we've got 1 less village, 30% less budget. So what are we going to do? What are we going to ask them? Right? I'll give you a hint. We never like to give money back.
Okay.
So don't make that one of the options. Yeah. Okay, we're all clear?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, I'll be back in a few minutes.
I guess okay, I understand now, because at first I was thinking that we already had the money given to us. So 1 village backed out, which means that there's more money for just the 2 villages instead of divided by 3. But from what I understand is the village is backing out before we get the money. Therefore, we're only going to get money for 2 villages.
No, I think we still have the same amount of money.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, we still have the same amount of money, because that's why he said we don't like to give money back.
Got it.
I can think of 2 options. I don't know about a third, but I feel like one option is we could maybe find another village to build a well in.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
You can find another village. Maybe you could also hold the money for a later project if you can't find a village right away.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, I guess that's kind of the same thing, to be honest.
I don't know if, because the donor has donated to like this project of the wells.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
Yeah, what we could do is, still build the 2 wells, and then within the same village that we're building the 2 wells for, use some of that money left over to build something else that would be, but let the donors know.
or like maybe use the money for like a sanitation class.
Yeah, something like that.
Something extra for
Yeah.
those 2, yeah.
So that's 2 options there, right?
Yeah. I don't know.
I
Do you guys
have
have any others?
give the money to another village, hold the money for later project, use the money for something extra.
What do you mean by use the money for something extra?
Like what Sarah was saying for like sanitation, like
Oh, right, yeah.
sanitation or education or something.
I can't think of anything else.
One that might be a little bit complicated. It's probably a bad idea, but maybe trying to work with an organization the village is comfortable with and just providing the already donated money to them. But not sure that's, I don't know, I feel like that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
It's an
Mhm.
idea. but I
It's
don't know if it's
definitely an idea. No, it is smart. The only thing I think of is like if this specific organization is given money, like they're giving money from their organization to build the well. So like if we just took their money from a different organization and let another organization work with them, it would be like that organization like taking credit for it almost or something. Or like some organizations want to be recognized that it was like their project.
Right.
Like it was our money, it was our project. I know some organizations like you see, especially with certain development projects, they all like have like the organization's like title or name on like the shirt or t-shirt or like.
Yeah. I was also thinking another problem with my idea is that the donors donate specifically to your organization, which means, in some way or another, that organization has gained their trust. So giving that money to another organization, even if it's for the same project, might not be, good use of
Would
it.
it be possible to like talk with Village One and like maybe reason with them? Would that be an option?
I would honestly say that's a good idea because we could find out what is the root cause of the reason that you don't want us to build the well. What's the reason? What's holding you back? Is it because you don't think that we're going to let you collaborate with us? Is it because you don't want us building a well that won't accommodate your needs? Like, what's the reason why you don't want us to build a well? Because like, what's the reason?
Right.
Yeah, that should probably be the first option, actually, and then try to work around what their issues
I agree.
or concerns are. I don't know who came up with that. It's a good idea, though. Sarah, I think.
Very good, Sarah, yeah.
Good plan.
Sarah, how do you say your last name?
Siptak.
Siptak, okay.
Yeah. Josh, sorry, how do you say your last name as well? I was wondering that.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, everyone in my family says it a different way. So I don't know. I just say Duri Sammy. So I just say it in a very extremely whitewashed way, but I don't know.
Wait, Rebecca, how do you say yours? I feel like whenever I say like I say like, oh yeah, I'm in a class with Rebecca Ladley.
Yeah, it's Ledley, so it's basically like lead of a pencil and then like Lee, but it's spelt Ledlie. But I get Ledlie, I get Leslie, I've only had one person ever pronounce my last name right the first try, and that was George Sweetman when I met him. And I was like, whoa, I'm surprised. But anytime during like commencement or graduations in the past, it would always be Rebecca Ledlie. And I like spell it out for people. I'm like, it's really not that hard, but
yeah. Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So how are you guys doing? Going okay?
Yeah.
I have to admit, I had like half an ear as I went to make some tea, but I was kind of listening. Yeah.
Sarah or Josh, did someone want to speak?
I wasn't writing it down, but I can do it for the best of my my memory.
I wrote it down like slightly, but
well,
I can give it a go, and if I forget anything,
yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, Rebecca, come back. Yeah.
Okay, so we said option one. The first thing that we would do was talk to Village One and maybe like ask them why they've kind of backed out, and like kind of to understand like maybe it's something that we can kind of work through. Like maybe they're just worried that we won't involve the community, or we're not going to give them what they want. Like we can kind of help them through that. Maybe that could be one option. Another option is to take the money from that would be going to Village One and kind of split it between Village 2 and 3 and implement and bring up some other activity or thing to implement, like maybe a sanitation class or something extra for those two villages. And then option 3 that we thought of was to reach out to a whole other village and just kind of copy and paste, or I guess just move the project from Village 1 to Village 4, I guess.
Okay. Fantastic. Was there anything, Rebecca, that she missed, or?
No, actually, but I noticed when we were speaking as a group, we automatically started going towards just, okay, we only have 2 villages now. And then Sarah kind of mentioned, and I know Josh was saying it was a good idea too. Sarah mentioned like, oh, what if we actually just firstly start with the village that backed out and try to see what the root cause is of them backing out. Like, let's try that for base one and then move forward, going forward, and then pick some other ideas. But for me, at least, that didn't come to mind. I just automatically started thinking of like other solutions. But I appreciate how they were like, oh no, let's actually try to talk to the village and work with them through this to see what the reason is they don't want the well, and maybe come out with an outcome where we can change kind of the thought process and how they feel about it, to see that we can actually continue with the project with them. So I thought that was good.
Very good. Yeah, very good. I wanted to, because when I just went out of the office here, I caught, I think Josh, you were raising one point about working with another agency that the village was comfortable with. I just want to highlight that one because that's probably the way I would think about it too, Josh. One of the things that you can do is, you find out, like you said, you guys would go back to the village, talk to them, deconstruct what happened. And if they're comfortable working with another agency, there's something called a subcontract that you can do within the charter that you get from your donor. So if you can find a partner that they are comfortable with, because I did mention one of the backgrounds was they don't want to work with us. So, maybe somebody upset them or, it happens. So find a partner and then go back to your donor and negotiate a subcontract with that partner. What that means is that once you set up an agreement or charter with that partner, you receive the money from the donor, and then you give that portion, that 30%, to build a well to that organization. And it's actually very beneficial for everyone because you still receive the full amount of money from your donor. You still get the full overheads, the costs that come with it, so you can claim some of your revenue that you expect. You're not giving the money back to your donor. And then you're giving it to another partner that actually is good for you because who knows, down the road, you might have another partner to work with. So it can be really a win-win situation. So I like that out of the box kind of approach. And I think going back to the village is really critical, as you guys had said. A couple other things you might think about. One is you could build an additional well within that village. Like, instead village 2 and 3, maybe go back and see if they need an additional well. Maybe one wasn't enough. So that's another possibility. And the other one is, I really liked the fact that you talked about diverting funds to other activities, like non-well construction activities. That's really good because, you might have to let staff go. That's another thing. You might have to let staff go, or you might have to reduce the number of stakeholders that you have if you're adding other types of activities. So you're not hiring, say, a contractor to build the well, but you might be hiring another partner to come in and actually advance the training that you were talking about. So lots of opportunities. Yeah.
Comment. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
just a quick comment with Josh's idea about doing that. I'm surprised that I've never heard of that at all, like the subcontract. So like 2 organizations working together. I've honestly never heard of that. And I think my initial thought process was, I think, more so from like an actual business standpoint of, I know a lot of, let's say, if businesses that necessarily aren't more like humanitarian or like nonprofit organizations, I've seen so many businesses before that just, if they're helping with something or donating, they like want the credit for it, and they would never want to partner with another organization because it's rivalry or competition.
Yeah.
So I just have a quick question about that. Do you find from your experience that nonprofit organizations, that there is some like rivalry or competition with that? Have you found that it would be easy for like kind of a subcontract to occur? Is that like a thing that you have seen regularly, or is it more so just kind of like a rarity?
Well, it's a fantastic question because I would say 20 years ago, 15 years ago even, the level of competition in the industry was huge because resources are scarce and organizations were so different that they were afraid to work with each other because they just had such a different ethos, different approach to things, different philosophy. And this was especially true within the Christian sector because, we talked earlier about coming out of so many different denominations. that many Christian organizations, NGOs, like Catholic ones, don't want to work with Protestant ones,
Mhm.
or even within Protestants, the Fellowship Baptists don't want to work with the Adventists, that type of thing. I would say that in the last 10 years, that has changed dramatically. And one of the big changes came when they created the Humanitarian Coalition. You can look that up on Google. It's a really interesting one. I was privileged to actually be part of the original design of that. And it involved four of the biggest organizations like CARE and SAVE and PLAN. And these ones basically came together because they said, we've been fighting over the scraps from the government of Canada for emergency response for so many years. Why don't we actually get together and build a synergy between not only receiving the money, but our different skill sets? Some of us are good at working with children, and children are severely affected, disproportionately affected during emergency times, disasters. Others might be really good in women's empowerment, others, in gender, others might be really good at implementation and delivery into humanitarian responses. So if we came together as 4 or 5 of these agencies, wouldn't we do it better? And it worked incredibly well. First 2 or 3 years were really tough. Now, in the last 5 years, I would say within the Christian sector, that's probably been my major focus, is partnership. And I'm going to show you a slide just before we finish, which is on the different types of partners that you could actually work with in international development. For me, I would say, Rebecca, it is the only way that we are going to successfully alleviate poverty, if we
Mhm.
can come together as partners. And sometimes those partners are what we call non-traditional, because we often think as NGOs that we have traditional partners. You work with other NGOs, church-based organizations.
Mhm.
But what about working for universities? I'd love at some point through my business to maybe form a partnership with Tyndale. We could have, university students like yourselves, when they graduate or near graduate, come out for internships, maybe send them out to Senegal for, a couple of months, and get some experience on the ground before you graduate, a practicum, if you like. So, this would be an amazing way to partner. But a lot of organizations are new at it, and they've never thought about partnering with universities.
Mhm.
That's one of the difficulties. How about hospitals? How about research institutes? We do a lot of early childhood education programs, but what about research institutes that look at the physiological development of a child's brain from birth, and the effects of trauma and the effects of cortisol and adrenaline, being in stressful environments, and how does that affect the development of the brain? So, we do a lot of these things, but we do it in bubbles. So if we can set up these types of partnerships, it would be amazing. And the last one I did was a program, you can see this on Google as well. It was called Promise, Promise. And it was 3 organizations, Emmanuel International, ADRA, and Christian Children's Fund. And they came together for the exact same express purpose of combining their different expertise. And we were addressing maternal and newborn healthcare. And basically, we said CCFC has a lot of experience delivering Canadian funded projects. So we will take the lead in submitting a proposal, and we will be responsible for the management of the project. So that became my responsibility at that time. ADRA, on the other hand, is really well known in the field for their monitoring and evaluation, knowledge management, and translation. So we immediately said, well, this would be a big, big boom, because CCFC wasn't as good at that. So they came on and they did all the baselines, end lines, collection of data, translation of the data, analysis, everything. And then Emmanuel International came in because they had a very certain sectoral focus, and they were working in Malawi. And we really wanted to work in Malawi, but neither ADRA or CCFC had an office there. So EI came in, Manuel, and they said, well, we have a really big office there, and we have a lot of experience implementing programs. So we'll be an implementing partner for you guys so that you have a footprint, boots on the ground in Malawi. And it was beautiful. And all Christian organizations, and it was the first coalition or consortium of Christian agencies coming together in Canada for a project. And as far as I can remember, I'm not even sure that they have done that before. It might have been the first of its kind. And it's still, even though it's closed now, it closed last December, it's still flagged as one of the gems or examples of partnership where we can work together and be stronger together. And that's the core message, stronger together. So yeah, it's a great question, and I would say wherever you can build partnerships, because I think that's the only way to succeed, honestly. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, Josh. Yeah.
So when I brought this up, I actually thought it was kind of a bad idea, because my first instinct was thinking about, if you're taking the money from the donor and giving it to another organization,
Mm.
like how will the donor feel about that? Because they've probably, singled your organization out as something they want to donate to. So if you take that money and give it to another organization, especially if you're, uh, taking from the donations for your overheads and stuff like that, it could just be really bad optics.
Yeah, yeah, and it can. I mean, there are cases, I'm sure, that that has been sort of viewed, optically as not a good approach. The other side to look at it is donors. There's two things really. Donors rely on the creativity and the professionalism of the agencies they're giving the funds to. And at the end of the day, the way they assure accountability is to sign a charter or a contract with one specific organization. So in this example, for example, it would be us, and they've agreed to give us the money. But the accountability still remains with us. So if something like this happened and we went back and said, it's unfortunate, these things happen, donors are pretty understanding. They know, it may have been our fault, probably not, and they would say, well, what's your solution? And you say, well, plan is actually working in that area. They have a really good inroad with the community themselves, and we want to split it off and give them one well to build in a village. And I've actually done this with the Promise Project in Ghana, in northern Ghana. So they will say, well, that's fine, but you are still accountable for the project. So if anything goes wrong with plans implementation, then it's on you. It's on your head. And they're not silly. They will also look at the partner you're suggesting, because they have a role in feeding back information to you, and they know plan. Everyone knows plan. Now, if you come in with a rogue organization and nobody's heard of them, they might question your judgment on it. But if you can prove that they're a worthy organization, they've done well, they have a lot of experience, then it's fine. And ultimately, you have to be responsible. If they don't deliver, then you have to ante up the 30% of that budget and pay it back to the donor. So that's part of the Accountability Act in Canada. So you can look that up as well. But it's a document like this, but essentially talks about the responsibilities of implementing partners to deliver foreign aid for Canada. But the interesting thing is there's different ways to partner and different types of partners. So a subcontract would normally, like if you wanted to work with a university or a research institute, you could set up a subcontract with them. And basically what that would mean is that you've agreed to, say, set aside $100,000, let's say, in your budget. It would be a single budget line item in your budget. It would just say subcontracts, $100,000. Now you're accountable for that. How you spend it, that's up to you. So we're spending it by giving it to this hospital, let's say, to do a very specific job for us. Now, in most cases, donors don't let you collect overhead on a subcontract. So that's often the case. So you have to be very miserly, only use subcontracts if you have to. They're preferred not. You should do everything that you can do as an organization, but there's certain very specialized tasks that NGOs just aren't equipped to do. So if you can prove that, like an engineering company to build that well because it's a special kind of well, then you have to pay a subcontract to them. But you may not be able to collect your overheads, which is your unrestricted revenue, what you put in your pockets to keep the lights on. So just got to be careful. The other way you can do it is if it's an implementing partner like Emmanuel International, they would be called a sub-partner, not a subcontract. So a sub-partner would be an implementing partner of your contract. All right. So for that, you would receive their money on their behalf because you're accountable for it. So all the money comes to you, comes to us. And then we would give a piece of that budget to Emmanuel International, and then they would implement their project. Now, you are accountable to your donor. So if they go off track, it's your fault, and you have to be responsible for that money. So what you do as a responsible party is you sign an agreement with your sub-partner. And that should be a very comprehensive agreement. The lawyers should have checked it. And in it, you put the accountability onto them. So the donor, when they come hunting down their money, they're coming to you, they're coming to us. But then we're going to be taking our lawyers and we're going to be going to the next step down and to our sub partner. So you see how that works. But at the end of the day, where it all sort of ends up, the buck stops, Josh, with us, because we're the recipients of the funds, and ultimately our reputation is at risk. But donors are pretty good. They really sort of leave the autonomy. They don't try to micromanage or tell us how to do the project. They leave it to our professionalism to figure it out. Yeah, great questions, guys. Yeah, you'll come across a lot of this kind of thing. So just before we get to the break, you saw that, in the example, there's lots of possible things that can happen to a project if, one of those factors is impacted, and it's up to the project manager then to figure out what the options are. So that negotiating with the stakeholders, beautiful. That's really the way we should start. And then we go to the donor and we try to figure out what those changes could be with our donor. And they always have a say in the matter because they're co-signing the charter. So something that happens a lot, more than I would like to say, but things rarely go to plan. That's just the reality of it. And you're always going to be facing those kinds of choices in terms of how you use your project resources to stay on time and to deliver quality results for the project and within your budget. So I wanted to discuss another critical issue of project management just before we hit the break here, and that's risk management. So of course, all of this, we keep saying we're expecting all these things to happen, but then you have to have a really good risk management plan. So adapting to all these changes. So if you read the article that I posted in our first week, which was called The Project, you'll get a glimpse of what I discovered personally really early in my career about the flexibility you need of being able to work outside of the box or outside of that blueprint. And by this, I just mean being able to adapt or respond to the change effectively. Changes in your environment, in your staffing, in funding, in policies, and many other areas that are really often outside of your immediate or direct control as a project manager. What can you do if one of your your senior staff people suddenly walk off the job and quit? This can be very, very detrimental in the short term to your project. But keep in mind that this is very different. This kind of adapting to change is very different from what the Project Management Institute would describe as adaptive project management. You'll hear that term, or you'll see that term when you're going online. Adaptive project management. And in that definition, the PMI is referring to being able to adapt throughout the project to different results that you achieve. So really what it's saying is you're learning from one set of results, and then you're working with your stakeholders to move on to the next step. So in a sense, you have to complete one milestone before you can move on to the next milestone in the project. So it's kind of an iterative, reiterative process. That's what that means. But to be clear, this is not what I'm talking about here. So if you see that term online, just be aware not to confuse the term. So that's not what I'm talking about in this case. What I'm talking about are the changes that are going to come throughout the project cycle that's going to force you to respond to your plan. So you're going to have your plan, but there's going to be things that are going to come that are going to be obstacles to you reaching your goal. And for you to stay on target, you've got to be prepared. So this is where you try to mitigate as many of those unforeseen events, as many as possible when you do your risk management process. And honestly, you rarely catch them all, but a good project manager will have a pretty good sense of all the possible things that could go wrong. So let me just put it another way. I don't know if you guys took the time to read that poem. It was just for fun. I put that poem to a mouse on our Moodle. And it's a famous poem by Robbie Burns. And you probably took a Google Translate to understand what he was saying. I like Robbie Burns and some of his poetry. But what Burns was talking about is the best laid plans of mice and men will go awry. And I'm sure you've heard that expression. And the key thing that I learned early on was that no matter how good your risk mitigation plan is or your design, something is going to go wrong in the process. You just need to assume this from the start. Don't get stressed out when it happens, because it's bound to happen. and just make sure that your design includes a good risk mitigation strategy, that it's flexible enough to respond when those things happen, because you're going to get everything from, oh gosh, outbreak of disease, a war, a flood, an earthquake, an election, a community dispute, probably, a disruption in your funding, roads being impassable, supplies that aren't arriving on time. You might see your suppliers of all the materials have suddenly upped their prices. Inflation in the community has shot up in the area you're working in, and many, many more things. Those are just off the top of my head. So you can tell I've been at this a really long time. So I've actually experienced all of that. So these are just common things. If you don't see those, I'd be quite surprised. So you're going to have to forecast and prepare your plans with those possibilities in your mind. So I used to, you'll laugh at this, but I used to teach everyone. Even I had a driver at one time in Bangladesh, and I even taught him this. But everyone should know Murphy's Law. Does anyone know Murphy's Law? You guys have heard of it, right? Yeah? Okay, if you haven't, okay.
I couldn't tell you like a specific, like I've heard of it, I just can't remember what the specifics of it are.
Okay, well, Murphy's Law is just very basically what can go wrong will go wrong. And people used to laugh at me all the time when I used to say that. So, you know, something unexpected happens, you're just about to pull out of your driveway, and just at that moment, somebody crosses in behind your car just as you're pulling out. You know, that you kind of say, well, that's Murphy's Law. You know, that's, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. And it served me really well in the field. So the best advice that I can give you guys as you prepare yourself to tackle project management, and it really doesn't matter where and what job, here in Canada, abroad, doesn't matter. What you should always, always do as a project manager is hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's basically how you fight Murphy's Law. Hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Always assume something is going to go off track, and you'll be in a great position to respond faster than everybody else in that area if you're prepared for it. And it really defines project managers, the skills. Like when people are ready, they really shine, and agencies really appreciate that as well. So what I'm saying is not, just to be clear, it's not the same as being cynical or negative or pessimistic, right? Because a lot of your staff might see it that way. If you're overly prepared and constantly talking about what can go wrong, people can see you maybe in that negative light. But just to put it bluntly, a project manager's job is not to be all bubbly, okay, in the office. That's not your job. Or to put a silver lining on everything that's going on. People complaining, or people, you know, problems are developing and you're just constantly being positive and, you know, oh, it's going to be fine. That's not your job. I mean, you probably should do that to keep calm, but that really isn't your job. If you just want people to like you, yeah, then maybe just be bubbly. But if you want to really manage a project, that really won't be enough. You have to maintain staff morale. That's super, super important. But always be looking around the corner before everyone else is. So you can anticipate, be prepared, make decisions quickly. And I can really guarantee to you that this will create a lot of respect for you in the job. And it'll help people to develop a trust in your judgment. Even though, you know, in the short term, sometimes it can really feel uncomfortable with your team because you're the person in charge of figuring all this out and predicting the problems and all that. A lot of staff, they just want to see the good stuff. You know, they want to come in, have a great day, get out. But your job is the long haul, start to finish of this project. So you've got to have both of those, you know, balancing both of those things in your mind. So the logic model and the risk management component are, to me, some of the most creative parts of the work, as well as some of the most important parts of the work as well. So we'll be spending more time on these as well in this course. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys take a break, but I just want to pause for a second if there's any questions about any of that so far, and then I'm going to, after the break, go into the project management cycle in detail. Anything?
I have a kind of maybe a general question.
Yeah.
What does it look like for women in project management? Like, do you see women being project managers a lot? Like, are they respected to these?
I was thinking that.
Were you?
Yeah.
I would say some of the best project managers that I have worked with were women, really skilled, really, really on top of their game, really understood the context, were culturally sensitive. So I would say yes, and so many more now than there used to be. I think agencies have made a really concerted effort to hire more talented and trained women. So the problem now, I think what agencies have had to cope with is that there's lots of other issues that have impacted women over the years. And part of it is a patriarchal kind of attitude, misogynist attitude within the sector. And this is not only coming from NGOs, but it's coming from some of the communities where we're working as well. So you can imagine that if you're working in an area of Africa, let's say, I don't want to pick on one country or another, but if you pick, say, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Senegal, on the west side of Africa, there has been for generations a very what would you call patriarchal type structure in the country, where women have very are expected to have very specific roles. And when you bring a foreigner into that mix, especially somebody coming in from Canada, doesn't matter what original nationality they are, they're Canadians coming into that context, there is a uphill battle, because you're gonna have a lot of male staff on your team, and they're gonna have these really entrenched attitudes. And most of the time they can accept it, but when you start getting into conflict situations where they decide they don't want to do something, and as a project manager, you have to start coaxing them, nudging them back on track, that's where the tension starts to develop. And I've seen that many, many, many times, where a male project manager could come in and they wouldn't hesitate. They'll jump immediately. But a female project manager comes in, doesn't matter if she's from that country or from outside, doesn't matter. They will reluctantly do it, but then they'll, snicker behind her back and kind of put her down. And it's hard for women, I think, to show any kind of emotion as well in that environment, because it's immediately seen as off. It's not, it's off culture, if you like, off the balance of their culture. So I would say most of the women that I knew, good friends of mine, felt they had to struggle a lot more, that they had to really maintain balance, they had to really be patient, which is unfortunate, but that seems to be the case in many cultures overseas. We're changing that. I think that's part of the role of NGOs, is to go in, and a lot of the gender work we're doing is looking at positive masculinity, if you like, for lack of a better way of putting it. Positive masculinity roles, teaching men that there are other ways, and boys as well, that there are other ways to address issues in communities, teaching them about women and girls' rights, about their access to basic services and the importance of it. All of these boys and men are, they have mothers and daughters, and they have aunts, and they have sisters. And sometimes they don't look at it that way, the way they treat women generally. They don't treat their family like that, but they might treat their neighbors like that. So our role is to go in there and try and, teach these positive masculinity concepts, so that they will start looking at gender equality in a different light. And I think generally, as that develops, their way of looking at management, women in management roles, even from their own community, has changed. So women's leadership is really starting to kick up in those areas. So where they would have laughed at them before for even trying in some villages, I had when I was doing my PhD, I remember I went out to Western Nepal, and I sat with a group of women, and we were talking about empowerment. And this old lady, I don't know how old she was. She looked about 80 something, but I don't know. And she had, like, all her teeth was missing, and she had this huge smile on her face, laughing. And I said, why is she always laughing at everything I say? And suddenly someone said, because she spoke a dialect, I speak Nepali, but I didn't speak the dialect. And she said, oh, because she thinks you're completely crazy. And I said, what? And she said, because there's no leadership here. Women can't be leaders. That's impossible. That could never happen. So they thought what I was coming in and talking about was completely foreign. It was off this planet. But by the end of the project, we had made such a change in their thinking. Men, just to give you an idea of positive masculinity, in Ethiopia, there's a place called Arsin Nagali, which is down in the south. It's mostly a Muslim area. And for some reason, at some point where, where many of these harmful traditional practices come from, who knows? But at some point in their history, they had decided that men, fathers, should not play with their children. So they shouldn't have that play interaction. Now, who on earth came up with this? I do not know. But I asked them, I said, why not? And they said, well, oh, it's very obvious, sir. You don't know? And I said, no. They said, well, if he touches the child or plays with the child, it's going to stunt their growth. And these are quite tall, strong people. But he said, no, the father would never get involved because their health will be affected and they'll have stunted growth. They'll all be short. And I thought, where does this come from? Like, where does this thinking come from? At some point, maybe some father was too lazy and decided to make up this rule that, he shouldn't play with his kids. So they had a culture whereby the father was the disciplinarian and the mother was the nurturer. And that was their roles were defined around that. So the feminine and the masculine roles were defined around that concept. So when we came in, we had a program called Learning Through Play, and it required mothers playing with their children, but more importantly, fathers playing with their children. And you can imagine when we first introduced this idea, they were off their rockers. I mean, they said, oh, no, that can never happen. So we eventually got 2 or 3 dads that decided to join our program, a little more progressive thinking guys. And one of these guys, it actually made us all cry. We had a family of about, in fact, I had the picture last week, I think, actually, come to think of it, on the PowerPoint. But we were all lined up in front of a hut. And this fellow had about 8 children. And 7 of the children were well grown. And the youngest was probably around, 8 or something like that. And the youngest had known the father when the father had gone through this program, Learning Through Play. And it taught him how to manufacture some toys from local materials. He cut up a plastic jerry can for gas, and he put wheels on it. And he made a little pull car, and he put a rope, and he pull his daughter around. And when we went to their house, we had 7 more grown children, all standing like this, with their hands tight to their chest, all standing back from us and giving their father a look because he was the disciplinarian. When he called their name, they were like in trouble and they were going to get punished. But the little girl, she was the 8th of the children, the youngest, and she was getting pulled around and demonstrating it. And when he walked out of the hut, the little girl looked up and waved and went, bye-bye, dada, bye-bye, dada, like that. And all the other kids were like horrified. They were like looking at her like, oh, you're going to get in so much trouble. But he had gone through a whole revelation in his mind, a whole transformation. And so had his child, because they had learned now to play together and build an attachment and a bonding. And that's an example of projects that we do out there. Now, he went as a representative of our project to all the other men in his community and said, you guys need to get behind this. You need to do this. And we started getting lineups of men coming in saying they'll join our program. Before that, they treated their women like dirt. They treated their kids like they were nothing. And afterwards, suddenly they were a family. And we literally cried when we saw the change, the transformation. So, it's sorry, long answer to your question, but, there's so much to do in communities around masculinity, positive masculinity. But the bottom line is, I won't fool you. It's tough. My daughter is, she's thinking of doing the same kind of work. And, I feel a little bit nervous because it's going to be hard. But if you know your stuff and you're professional and you keep balance, keep patient, you definitely can do it. Yeah. Sorry, long answer, right? Okay, guys, do you want to take a 15-minute break and then we'll meet back? Cool. All right, great. We'll see you in a few. Bye.
I'm sorry.
Hey, yeah.
I'm back. I'm probably gonna turn off my camera because I'm eating my dinner. So I just wanted to let you know
Sure.
I'm here, but my camera.
No problem. That's fine. What are you eating?
Um, it's kind of a everything I can find meal. I'm eating a piece of my mom's sourdough with bread, butter, and salami, and leftover pasta.
Oh, okay. Leftover pasta. Okay. All right. Well, enjoy your meal, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We got Joshua and Rebecca back. You guys there?
Yes, sorry. I'm just going to eat
No
my dinner, if that's okay.
No problem. Yeah. And you can turn your camera off too if you want to do that.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, it's up to you. Hey, Josh. Okay, guys. Terrific. So for the last bit of this class, let's look at the project management lifecycle in more detail. I want to walk you through, oh, you can hear me okay, right? Okay, excellent. Okay. I want to walk you through each of the stages just to get a really good grasp of the priorities in each of them. So first, we have the concept or initiation phase. So you saw this before. It's sometimes referred to as the project charter stage, which is like a contract agreement or some kind of undertaking. And it's described by the project management body of knowledge as a document that formally authorizes the existence of a project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. Now, I can tell you pretty assuredly that we rarely use this term charter in development. It's just not a term that I'm very familiar with. So it's more of a formalized project management term. In fact, I would say almost never use it. What we often use instead or substitute is the project proposal, which is submitted to the donor for funding, and the agreement with the donor, which is based on the proposal. All right, so it's that contract that you get back from your donor. And once a proposal is selected for funding, the donor will typically write out an agreement. If you are working with the Government of Canada, this is often called the contribution agreement. You'll see that that is the predominant type of contract that they sign off with implementing partners. And it will have the description of the project, along with the details, the budget, the scope or deliverables, the risks that are anticipated that we talked about, a reporting schedule, and it would have a logic model that we included in the proposal when we first submitted it. So in particular, all the compliance requirements that the donor wants to have. And then this is signed off by both parties. It's signed by the donor and it's signed by the recipient agency, whoever that is, and it governs the remainder of the project. So this is technically your charter within the context of the international development sector. So if you hear that term, then you know how to relate it. So one thing to keep in mind is that there are opportunities to change some of the methods and tools and budget before you launch into your implementation phase. So, you know, when you've signed your charter, you still have some wiggle room to make or flexibility to make changes, but those should generally be very limited and they're generally not recommended, I would say. So once you have an agreement with somebody to get their money, you don't want to go changing the rules of the game at the last minute. So it has happened, it can happen, but it's really not recommended. So the charter is what you've agreed to do. And it's the reason that you got those very scarce funds from the donor. So ultimately, you need a pretty good reason to go back and renegotiate so quickly before you start implementing. So here is a typical process that you might see happening in an agency to get to the charter stage or the agreement and project implementation plan. First, there has to be a reason for moving ahead with a specific project. In our first class, you probably remember, I went over some of the reasons why we might move ahead with a project in the first place. And there are innumerable reasons for starting a project, as you can imagine, and they're usually unique to each agency. But in each case, the organization applying for those funds has to justify the use of its resources to prepare a proposal in the first place and get ready for implementing a project. So that's just internal within your organization. You have to prepare a case. So there will normally be a business case, is what we normally call it, that you would have to prepare. And I'll be showing you how to do that in a later class. So that's one of the tools that we'll be looking at. And again, a business case is fantastic in any sector. So if you end up not doing international development, believe me, the business case or the preparation of a business case is really a really good tool to get the buy-in from all the different people and stakeholders within your organization. So it won't be wasted. And this can really take all sorts of forms. It can be really a detailed proposal to the organizational leadership. It can be as informal as a sit-down meeting and a presentation. It can be a formalized, what we call a go, no go committee of cross-functional departments. So it's where everyone comes together and they're looking at the case and making a decision to move it forward or not. That's why we say go or not go. And in that case, you're reviewing the pros and cons of the project, and you're seeking approval and buy-in from each of the departments within your organization that are going to have a stake in the project. So I'll give you an example. Your marketing and communications department has a big stake because they have to often raise additional money to provide for a match contribution to a government grant. They often give money from the Canadian government, but they require that you raise 5 or 10% of the resources yourself. So marketing obviously has a big role. Or perhaps they have to run a new campaign, or they have newsletters to showcase the results of the project and the stories. So they're part of that report back schedule. Finance could have a big role because obviously they have oversight of all the projects and the budgets, and they have the responsibility to report back to their board on those projects. So when you think about it, each department in your organization has something to add to the conversation. They're accountable or maybe responsible for some aspects of the project. And really, it's up to the person who's pitching the project to work out what those responsibilities would be and to make sure that those are discussed in your go, no go meeting or your business case. So preparing for any of these, you'd normally do, at the very minimum anyway, an environmental scan just to see what's going on in the environment, the trends, the risks, all of that kind of thing. And probably you would do a SWOT analysis as well. And I think you all know how to do that. So just to make sure you've looked at all the pros and cons. And ultimately, what we're doing at this stage is we're putting together a convincing case for the organization to undertake a particular project. And it helps move the process through the formal or informal approval steps in the agency. And it authorizes the grants team to assemble and to begin their work on a proposal for the donor. So the assembled teams or staff that I called, they're often called a grants team, or maybe they're called a new business development team. They're the ones who work on the proposal. And in concert, they start working out the details of the project that they want to implement, how to do it. They prepare a budget. They do the logic model and that performance management framework. You remember last week we talked about the methodology for collecting data and that template for putting it in. That's a performance management framework. And basically, there are all sorts of techniques and tools for preparing a winning proposal. And it really requires team effort, stakeholder engagement, interpersonal skills, conflict management, because there's a lot of moving pieces and parts. And of course, lots and lots and lots of meetings and communications. So that's all before you even get to starting your project. So once our proposal narrative and our budget is complete, and I'll be showing you also how to prepare a budget, it's signed off within the agency and submitted to the donor. And it then goes through a process of vetting. And if you're successful, you'll get that really rewarding letter or email from the donor that says, congratulations, you've won. Not exactly like that, but that's pretty much what it is. And that, by the way, is one of the greatest feelings of any grants manager, is when that donor letter comes in that says you were successful, because you put your heart and soul into these proposals. And when you get a rejection, it feels pretty bad. But now you get to work in finalizing the project charter or the agreement. So you've reached that stage. And usually what the donor will do is prepare that agreement. They usually do it themselves, and they'll outline all of the compliance things that they require. Basically, it's their do's and don'ts for the implementing partner, what they've agreed to fund and what they haven't agreed to fund, et cetera. So often the donor will have a phone call or a meeting with a recipient agency after they've informed them that they've won. And particularly, they'll want to talk to the person who's in charge of compliance. And most organizations, they give that task to the chief finance officer or the CFO of the corporation or the NGO. And it's that person's responsibility or accountability, let's say, to convince them all the controls are in place for them to be accountable for that project. That's why you want it to go to as high a level as you possibly can. But likely, if you're the one leading the proposal, you'll be in that meeting with the CFO because they won't have all the information on the project. So this is a really important step and meeting that you have to hold in that process. So at the end of the day, you will have a document in your hand that describes the project. It tells you what's required of the project management team and the manager to ensure that it's delivered successfully, basically what's expected by the donor. Okay. So now, with the authority to move forward and plan the use of your resources, it's a great start. That's really where you want to get to. Now it's up to the project manager and the project management team to develop what's called the implementation plan or project implementation plan. We often use the acronym PIP, and that's usually the short form. And we're, by the way, in the NGO sector, we're really, really well known for the use of acronyms. Like sometimes you'll sit in meetings and honestly, you don't understand a word they're saying because they're just throwing in so many acronyms. But when you hear PIP, that's Project Implementation Plan. And keep in mind, you can't, oh yeah, this is important. You can't spend a cent of your donor's money up until this point. That's really, really critical. So without a signed agreement, when you get that charter and it's got the donor signature on it, anything you spend up to that point is on you. Okay, it comes out of the agency's unrestricted or general revenue. So you got to keep that in mind. And that's why the pitch is so important. When you are convincing them, you're basically convincing your leadership to spend money that won't be reimbursed. So you're hedging your bet that you're going to get a project that's going to pay back these overheads, which is going to pay back all the money you invested in writing the proposal. So that's a really critical thing to keep in mind. So you're not going to just be pitching like one project after the other. You only want to pitch the ones that you think you have a reasonable level of success to be awarded the funding. So now we're into the planning phase, definition and planning. And in development projects, this is sometimes often referred to as the PIP, the Project Implementation Plan. So just to sort of relate the two. So once you've got your approval from the donor and they've given you a green light to proceed, the first thing the recipient agency does is to create this project implementation plan. And it's based on the charter or the agreement that you've just signed with your donor. And this PIP is also signed by both parties before the project can move forward. It's really the detail, the devil in the detail for running your project. And the document is a breakdown of the agreement to deliver on the compliance requirements of the contract between the two parties. And there'll be regular check-ins with the donor. They like to get involved throughout this whole process, just to ensure that everything's on track before implementing the project. Usually it's a bit of a nerve-wracking time. It's a time when everybody's a little tense because you're getting ready to implement and spend the money. So they just want to make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And this plan, once it's completed, that gets submitted to the donor for verification and approval. So they just want to make sure it's in line with what they've agreed up until that point, just to calm their nerves. So you can see that there are all sorts of checks and balances in the process, even up to this point. And this is even before any money has exchanged hands or you've even started managing your project. So it's a huge amount of stuff that's going on. And the donor will fund, this is important, they will fund you to create the PIP. Because if you think about it, you have now signed off on the charter and the PIP comes next. So everything you do for the PIP, and there's a lot of stuff you have to do, including hiring, that is all reimbursed by the donor in your budget. So you budget for that. Okay, so that so far sounded complicated, but it gets more complicated. So this is where things sort of kick into high gear. And if you're one of the lucky project managers who was already lined up to run the project in advance of the agreement being signed, then you'll have a chance to produce the PIP. That's a great place to be as a project manager because you get to put your own personal touch on the whole design of the project. It's my personal preference because really it's hard to change things later on. You know, as Josh said earlier, donors don't like a lot of those kinds of changes. So, you know, you try to avoid any kind of right or left turns that are unexpected if you can. So, and if you're not there from the start of all this design that's going on, you're going to inherit a list of things like tools and methods and work plans and schedules and reporting timelines that are going to govern your work. And you'll just have to try to mold your work style around that, or over time, try to nudge them gently into sort of more alignment with your style of working, your way of doing business. Now, in the planning phase, you have a number of immediate responsibilities. You have to define the roles and responsibilities of your team and its organization. So you need to demonstrate a really very clear reporting system within your organization. It's one of the key things you have to do right from the start. Who's reporting to whom and how? And then you define that accountability within the project structure. It's all about accountability for the donor. And I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about that exercise. So the donor will want to see ultimately your organizational chart or your human resource plan. So during this activity, you need to define the skills of your team, you know, what kind of skills you're going to need, what positions are needed for the plan, what's expected from everyone, and a job description has to be created for every single position that you have funded. So anything in your budget goes to your donor has to have a job description attached to it so they all know what to expect. And then next, you have to create a scope statement. And in our project agreement, there's going to be an annex to the contract. And that's going to clearly define what your project is about. It's basically the description of your project and what it expects to deliver as well. So the boundaries or the limits of the project are really clearly laid out, what's expected, what's not expected from the project. And then there's going to be accompanying tools with things like the logic model, the PMF, and all the indicators. And you'll have the references to necessary for compliance regulations that are all going to be listed online. So your donor is going to tell you to comply to this, go here. To comply to, say, gender equality issues, go here. To comply with the rights framework, go over here. So you'll be able to click on it, goes to their website, gives you clear definition and all the templates that you need to report back to your donor. So next you've heard about, or perhaps you've used, the Gantt chart. I think we talked about that right at the beginning. So Gantt charts are extremely useful as planning tools, just to visualize the steps in the project. So I always create these as a first step because it really lays out the responsibilities, the timelines, the milestones, and the tasks. And I usually, it's kind of funny, but I usually print a very big copy of it. I get it printed at a printer shop, as big a copy as I can possibly get. And I keep it on my wall in my office. And I come in and I refer to it every morning when I walk in. First thing I do before I sit down, I put my bag down, I go through my Gantt chart just to see where we are in the process and to refresh my planning around that. And I also use it to report back to my team. I have my weekly team meetings with my leadership team. And I always expect that they will have a copy of it as well. They always should have the project Gantt chart as well. So we can refer to it in our weekly meetings. And this is really also going to help you in doing your performance evaluations. Another necessary part of the job, not always the most pleasant, is doing evaluations on your team members, because it's clearly mentioned who is responsible for each activity and milestone, and your evaluation of your staff is going to be on how well they're accomplishing those tasks. So it's your responsibility to ensure every key activity or milestone here is laid out with a defined time period for delivery. And usually these are created with, the flexibility to adjust the activities, that are bound to certain deliverables. So for instance, if you have a delay in one activity, maybe it will automatically adjust all of the others that are dependent on the delivery of that one item. So if you can automate it, use one of those online programs like MS Project or something, it will automate it. So you can actually put an anchor in there. If one changes and the others are dependent on it, it'll automatically shift them. So you don't have to manually do that. So you don't have to put, at least in the Gantt chart, all the sub activities, but some people do. It just depends how detail oriented you are. I find for me, it's just a lot easier to keep those in a separate file or even a tab in your, if you're using Excel, MS Excel, and you can refer back to it just to determine if it's something on time or it's not on time. But I don't like to clutter up my Gantt chart with too much detail. It just gets really hard to read. But besides being an excellent resource for you, it provides comfort to external stakeholders as well. So for me, it's also a communication tool externally because they're concerned about the tasks being delivered on time as well. And you can imagine when they're in headquarters back home, wondering how the project's doing, if you can flash the Gantt chart at them and tick off those critical milestones and say, we're right on track, or if we're not, this is how we're adjusting for it. They're watching like a hawk as well, and this can really put their nerves at ease. And what it does is it develops the confidence that really strengthens your relationship with your donor, and that's so important. You want them to be confident in you as a project manager. And so these are little tricks that you can do that really kind of builds that interpersonal relationship. And the milestones that you list here in the Gantt chart are like your mini goals, which you're required to complete during the project lifecycle. So it's up to you how you want to define your milestones, since they could be key activities, that have to be completed before other things happen. And that's sort of what I was implying when I talked about adaptive project management method. Or they could be just tangible deliverables. It could be like a technology or something that has to be constructed before something else can happen. So in the case of our well, before we can do training in water and sanitation and hygiene, we need a well. We can sort of do one before the other. So, or classroom to do training. So another key deliverable in the planning phase is a solid communication plan. So now we're going to be looking at this a little bit deeper in a later class. And I told you I'm going to be bringing in a communication specialist to give us a bit more detailed insight into their world. It's a very specialized area. But essentially, it's going to show how the team and the stakeholders are going to be communicating with each other throughout the project and how the reporting of the project is going to be handled. So the dates, the formats, the requirements, the types of information you need, building those interrelationships, and so on. And communications really happens in all sorts of ways, as you can imagine, but you'll have set documents that need to be delivered at certain times. Your agency will need personal interest stories, for example, from the community for fundraising purposes. Local government is going to need set templates filled out for reporting. Your community stakeholders might require meetings and documents to loop back with them and discuss those adaptations you're making in your project, just to see how things are going generally. And there's going to be audits and all sorts of other requirements. So you just need to have your communication plan really well organized. And one of the most important aspects of planning, and I've already talked a little bit about it earlier, is performing a risk analysis, so your risk mitigation. And obviously, it's always better to be prepared for issues than to be surprised. So I usually recommend a series of meetings with my field teams to identify those potential risks to the project, and then you categorize the extent of those risks. I usually do it as low, medium, high impact, just as an example. And then you come to identify what those risks are, and then you need to start developing your plan B, which is really, you keep it in your back pocket. It's something you do, and then you put it away. You pull it out every now and then just to make sure it's refreshed, that it's still valid, or if anything you need to add or take out. But it's generally something you keep in your drawer, and you pull it out when and if the time arises that you need it. So generally, a risk mitigation plan, or a registry, it's often called a risk registry, it'll help you identify all the possible contingencies that could come up in the project lifecycle. So GAC uses this type, what I'm showing here, this type of template, which allows you to assess the likelihood of something happening along with the impact that it will have. So if you were to look at a risk registry for a health project last year, you might see that a pandemic happening in 2020 could have a detrimental, really serious, high impact on the project, but it would have a likelihood of 1 or 2 at most. We would never have expected a pandemic. So go figure, right? And this is what Robbie Burns said, the best laid plans of mice and men. So who would have known? Actually, I saw a report last year from one of our associations, and it had pandemic as one of the risks, and it rated the pandemic out of 1 to 10 of happening as a 1. So, and then 6 months later, we had a pandemic. So go figure. So the idea is, again, you would list all of the eventualities and you would go through a similar process for each and every one of them, but would also add your contingency or your backup plan. Nothing's off the table, guys, in this type of exercise. Okay, there's no stupid responses. You put everything on the table and discuss it with your team. You have to look at the geopolitical issues, environment, climate, community engagement. Are they going to engage or not? Or could they, possibly not later on? There's going to be economic issues, market disruptions, transportation issues, the elections I mentioned earlier. That happens a lot. Sort of snap elections get called and everything freezes. So you rate each of these identified issues according to the perceived or anticipated impact on your project. And for each one, you have to determine what your course of action is going to be in relation to the project implementation plan that you've written. So if you're in the emergency response sector, you might identify access to markets, goods and services as a potential risk, because obviously you're going to need to access water, containers for water, food, bags, all that stuff. Vendors, when they see that happening, one of the risks is they always hike their prices up. As soon as they see international development agencies coming in, great opportunity to hike the prices. And you think, in a disaster, really, this is what you're doing. But it happens every single time. It's just market demand. So this would be disastrous in the longer term for your project. So you might think about solutions. A plan B might be about purchasing early and pre-positioning in warehouses if it's an area that's really high risk for disaster. So I can give you an example in Haiti, and you can ask our government friend when he comes on. A lot of warehousing is going on, and people are stockpiling relief supplies with agencies just in case there's another flood, earthquake, hurricane, the usual things that hit Haiti. So these are the types of risks you would be listing out, and you'd determine all these workarounds for it. Now, just before we leave the planning cycle, I want to draw your attention to another fine distinction, really fine distinction in project management. Because up to this point, it's very possible that the organization has not yet identified a project manager. Okay, often you get right up to the point of implementing before they actually bring somebody in. So technically, again, the PMBOK book, that big book, will say there's a difference between what is called the project cycle and the project management cycle. Okay, project cycle, project management cycle. And the only distinction here is that in the first one, project cycle, there's no project manager. So you would say even all that design stuff that I was talking about at length and the submission and all that goes on before you get to inception, that first phase, and your charter, all of that is part of a project cycle. But until your manager is on the ground, boots on the ground, it is not project management cycle. Okay, so we always assume your project manager will be there for the inception, for the first phase of that project cycle. That's always the assumption. So I only mention it because it's important we know these distinctions, because again, people, one could argue there are proxy managers handling the initiation and planning phases before the actual manager is hired. But when we get to the end of the project and it closes, we might also have lost our project manager to another job. That often happens. And yet we still have some financial obligations on the project, like an audit or a project evaluation. So this then becomes part of the project cycle again, and it's not the project management cycle. Okay, so just always assume it's when your project manager is there and running your project. So I hope it's clear. It's a bit of a fine distinction, but it's a really important one. And it will help you sort out all those different models that you'll see online, because I think what people are doing, at least my understanding, my observation, is that they're confusing these two terms. And that's why you see a lot of terms thrown into the project management cycle that really shouldn't be there. And I think it's because they're just kind of adding all the project cycle stuff as well. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so we'll move to the execution phase, or implementation, we'll call it. And this is obviously the longest phase of the project cycle, and is the one where your outputs are developed and delivered for your community stakeholders. And we've talked a lot about that. So the project manager's role here is to ensure that the project is monitored and that the controls and the policies in the project are maintained. That's the job. So the plans are maintained as well, and they ensure that everything is being delivered on time and that nothing is being done outside of the scope of the project, which is being approved by the donor in the charter. So that's their primary accountable responsibility. So throughout this phase, you're also adapting your project plan to the local context and managing the various processes. And there are 9 processes, and I'm going to be coming back to those in a moment, just before we finish out tonight. 9 processes. So the project manager not only has the function of managing the project, but also providing leadership to the project team. So leadership and management, as you probably know, are very different things. Leadership is requiring the setting of a vision for the team, exerting influence on relationships and activities without becoming autocratic, and finding ways to get the most out of others in terms of their production and their quality, and that eventually will achieve excellence in your project. Those are the qualities of a leader. So leadership isn't about power or position. So you could be a project manager, or you could be the chief bottle washer. It really doesn't matter. You could have the influence and you could be a leader in that context. So it has a much broader definition. But it's equally important for the manager to demonstrate. You can have a really qualified project manager, but with lousy leadership skills, and the project can still fail. So one of the more difficult tasks that you'll have on your plate is team development. So working to develop the operational plan, building capacity of your staff and your partners. Bless you. And they will be assigned to developing their work schedules, coordinating their activities during the project implementation phase. And you'll be responsible for providing support and clearing obstacles for your staff. So your job is about making your staff do their jobs better, in a sense. So some of your teams will be handling program delivery, like education, health activities. Others are going to be managing things like procurement, purchasing. Others are going to be managing administration. But it's your job as project manager to have a hand in all of the departments, make sure they're all running optimally and achieving the best quality impact and standards they possibly can. So ultimately, you're going to have some key deliverables that include the outputs in the logic model, but also the reporting requirements. And that includes financial reports, the program reports, and so on. These have to be delivered on time. They have to be communicated to your donor, your community stakeholders, at set times throughout the project. And that's defined by the project charter as well. So you're going to find that a lot of your time is spent just managing teams. And sometimes project managers will say, that's all I seem to do is manage teams and conflicts. But really, if your team succeeds, guys, you succeed. And that should always be first and foremost in your mind. If they fail, you fail. So it's not about how good you are. It's about how good you can be to your team to make them succeed. And that's a really, really important principle to keep in mind. So the performance and control phase is the next one, is sometimes referred to as the monitoring phase. And we've touched on this last week. But as I mentioned earlier, it's occasionally not mentioned as a phase, and instead it's kind of seen as integrating across the whole of the project cycle. So don't freak out, if you don't see it in some of the charts online. I think it's just easier to separate it because it's such an important piece of our project management work. It needs to stand out in my mind. So we had a chance to go over this a little bit with our 2 guest speakers and took us through the elements of what they call knowledge management. And the principal purpose of that and monitoring is just to ensure that you have adequate means of controlling the different steps of the project cycle. So in particular, monitoring is about, measuring progress, measuring the objectives, and it's through regular reporting and analysis all the way throughout the project. So it's really important to have your implementation plan at the start, but as I mentioned, because a lot can happen along the way that's trying to push you off your course, that if you're monitoring your process as you go along, it's one of the most important ways that you can make adjustments and quick decisions that will get you back on track and keep you out of trouble with your donor as well. So we talked last week also about having those clear baselines, the data at the start of your project, and then developing our result statements and our result indicators that we would then expect to have when we do our end line. So you see your baseline and your end line. And our monitoring on a regular basis is going to allow us to ensure that our results to date are in line with the expected outcomes that we have in our logic model. So the earlier you can detect deviations in your data, the easier it is or will be for you to fix the problem. So clearly, if you've missed your training output targets, let's say by 50%, you have 50% less cohorts coming in, and you're in your last year of a 4-year project, you have a big problem, right? You clearly got to the end and oops, I just realized that happened. So spotting that problem back in year 2 or year 3, that's going to give you the opportunity to adjust the time, cost, and scope of your project. So the earlier you can spot these things, the better. And the better your monitoring system is, the earlier you'll spot it. So really your M&E system's set up to inform some really critical processes of your project. And I've grouped these processes into 2 categories, just to make it easier, because I mentioned earlier there's 9 of them. So the first consists of what I would call or not me, but what we would call the four core processes. So these include scope, schedule, budget, and quality management. So I imagine that sounds very familiar to you at this point, because I've been harping on about it quite a bit. And that, of course, relates to time, cost, and scope, and quality of our triple constraint. So essentially, core processes in management help you manage that triple constraint, including the quality piece of it. And they are, by definition, the processes that are going to determine your project's success. So whether you're on time, on budget, within the scope, and quality, defined by your PIP and requested by the community stakeholders. These are going to be your 4 key ones. And in the second group, that's grouped into 5 supporting processes. So we had core process, now we have the supporting processes. And these include the management of teams, I talked about, stakeholders, information systems for your data collection, risk, and contracts. Okay, so I've sort of touched on all of those. And these processes help facilitate management and make it possible for the project to achieve its objectives fully and really effectively. So they really add a lot of flavor to the quality of your program. And these 9 processes in total, ultimately, if you have them all planned out really well in the planning phase, because you got to do this ahead of the implementation, and if they're monitored really effectively, they're going to provide you with a solid ground on which you can write your reports for the project and ensure that you have successful results. And donors love it. Donors absolutely love it. So remember, the 9 process groups are prepared in the planning phase, but they're implemented in the implementation phase and monitored throughout. So there's like 2 different places. Yeah, Sarah.
Sorry, what was the last core process? I just missed it.
Of the core process?
Yeah.
So that was scope, schedule, budget, and quality management.
Okay.
Yeah. Scope management, schedule management, budget management, quality management. Yeah. Okay, so before we finish off then, the project management lifecycle, I've still got the closure phase to come back to. I just want to take you, since I've already mentioned it, I just want to take you through the 9 process groups really quickly. And I of course, I've already touched on it a little bit. So let's just go quickly one by one. According to PMBOK again, the processes are a logical grouping of project management inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. All right. So I'm going to put it in a simpler way. They're just a set of actions taken to achieve a particular goal. All right. That just keeps it a lot more simple. And if you want to say that, if I put it in a test or anything, you're quite welcome to use that definition instead. And they occur throughout the life cycle of the project. And they're in a cyclical approach that requires that we conduct the planning, doing, checking, learning, all the way through, back and forth, just to ensure that quality is achieved throughout each of the processes. So it's an ongoing exercise that you have to keep doing throughout the project. Also remember, just so you don't confuse them, these are not the project management phases. I know some people have confused those two things. Those are separate. I've shown those already. These are the processes, and they're quite different things. So managing the 9 processes is probably, I would say, the most critical role of a project manager. The whole role of integrating and coordinating all of them together. And obviously, by their nature and by the the nature of the project, how much time you devote to these processes will depend on a lot of factors. So the project manager really just becomes the coordinator of these 9 process groups, and you also task your team to manage them. So you may have a very large and technically complex project, which is going to require all sorts of specialized resources and people to manage the processes. But on the other hand, a small and relatively low budget project might give you the luxury to just decide how much effort you want to spend on each of them. So it really just, every project is quite different. And I've described earlier that a project management is about bringing a capable team together to plan and implement a series of interrelated activities that have to be accomplished by a certain date. Because all the complexities of managing projects in communities overseas, you need to divide these processes into interrelated and manageable parts, basically. I call them bite-sized pieces, or just, bite-sized processes. You don't want to bite off too much, because otherwise the whole thing's going to collapse. So doing it that way just allows the project manager to control the outcomes of the project and manage the different challenges in each of the processes as they go along. Okay, so I'm going to go through very quickly these different processes just so you have an idea of what they entail. And we'll start with the core processes. So just a heads up, they're likely to be on your midterm. It's a little hint. And this video will be online as well, so you can go back and check it. Okay, so here they are, the 4, and we'll start with scope. So project scope management is just about managing the work required to achieve the project objectives, basically. So it'll ensure the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. So if you go outside of the agreed scope during a project, you end up with what we call scope creep or scope drift, okay? Just is exactly what it sounds like. And it just means you've inadvertently, hopefully not on purpose, gone outside of the boundaries of what was defined in the project charter. And the project manager is going to be overseeing all of these activities to ensure that you stay in the plan. So in my last project, I think I may have told you, in Senegal, up until the end of December just last year, I arrived and I was faced with some partners who had revised their plans. And they planned actually to overshoot their training targets in the last year of the budget of the project. They had some budget left over, and they thought it was just fine to go ahead and use it up on some extra trainings. So, you think that's a big no-no, and it's going to result in scope creep because, it's likely okay, but, it's not in your plan, and the donor didn't agree with it. So another partner of the same project in Senegal had no budget for carrying out some entrepreneurial training that they wanted to do, and they got it from another local partner who had underspent. And they thought it'd be okay just to transfer the money over and incorporate it in part of their training activities. And when I found out, it was already too late, but that's another big no-no in the project cycle. So approvals and authority have to be maintained, and the project manager is the only one who can decide if those big changes can happen or not. If you've not signed off on it, then it is what we call a disallowed cost. And ultimately, you end up paying that back to the donor. They'll ask for their money back if it's not in the plan. So just be really aware of that. So project schedule management is our next one. And it's about managing the time schedule, like it sounds, for all of your project activities. So people use all sorts of tools for tracking it. They have things like MS Project, I mentioned, the Gantt chart method, I always find is good. There's a time flow management method that you can use, and so on. And when we go over the work breakdown structure, which we'll do eventually, you'll see how we plan projects by deconstructing the outputs and activities down to what we call sub-activities. And we're able to lay everything out in a monthly or quarterly plan that's going to indicate how we'll be proceeding to carry out the project plan generally. And then you have your project resource or project budget management. I think most people call it resource. I call it budget management. And it's essentially that. It's managing your funds given by the donor and are utilized in accordance with the terms spelled out in the agreement of the charter. So it includes the steps in identifying, steps in acquiring, managing the resources needed for a successful completion of your project. So here we're talking about fiscal duties. Okay, you'll hear that term, fiscal responsibility or fiscal duty of the project manager and the accountability over the project's budget. Now, just, you know, when I went out there, I was really scared to death in my first big project because I hadn't really developed a strong financial background. I didn't have enough experience, so I was really scared. But it's good to know that if you have strong people, and I brought in a really strong finance manager, he was able to walk me through it. And I was able to sort of hold his hand through the process. And I was able to apply my management skills onto an area that I wasn't quite so strong in. So it's just, you know, something to be aware. Acquiring a good team can really help out a project manager because you can't be good at everything. That's just the reality. So you're going to be responsible ultimately in this for just expenditure tracking, just the way you would with your own expenses at home. And you'll see that you're getting fair market prices from the market for supplies and materials, that the activities you're doing are being carried out in a responsible way, fiscally responsible. And remember, you are the steward of the donor's funds. And ultimately, they're often public money and people have given to charity or they've maybe done it through their taxes. So, you know, we just need to be cognizant of being aid effective and good stewards of the project resources. And the next one is project quality management. And that's about ensuring that all the project activities and actions have clear standards for meeting quality assurance. It just includes the steps in incorporating the organization's policies regarding your planning, your managing, your controlling of the project, your product quality requirements, just in order to meet stakeholder expectations. And every agency has different quality standards. You just need to be aware of what those are. And usually the donor is the benchmark for what your quality will be. And when we make a pact with a community to deliver a project, it's just assumed that we're going to do it with the intent of being ethical and considering our stakeholders in the community as pivotal to our success. So I like to use the term honest broker when I talk about international NGOs, because we don't have a vested stake in the money of the project generally, nor do we have the politics of the community on our shoulders or the country. And we're there really to see that, you know, people's lives are transformed, families are raised out of poverty. And for that, you know, we should be doing everything in the project we can with the intent of being at the highest quality at all times. And that's why we really should be honest brokers. So within these four processes, guys, we have the ability to manage and monitor that triple constraint as well as the quality aspects of the project. So just at risk of repeating myself over and over, these core processes are linked to the triple constraint. Okay, so just to remember to keep those in mind. Now I'm going to just go through the support processes really quickly, and here they are, the 5 of them. Okay, and these are the ones I said add value to project management as well. And I'm just going to describe for you the top 5. There are actually a few others, but when you see the normally described, these are the ones that are usually standing out, but I'll just list the other ones really quickly. Okay, so project team management, let's just start there. That just relates to your project team, managing them, developing the team, evaluating their performance, and it includes building capacity and providing training as needed. So it's just all the steps to manage a set of individuals in your team who support you as the project manager in performing your work, okay? So now every project manager has their own style, and I talked about that last week, but how you form your team is going to be super important to the project success. So for me, remember, this is where things often go off track for projects. So management of teams is governed by, unfortunately or fortunately, by personality. So if you get the wrong mix of people or you have an autocratic project manager, it can quickly turn teams into being demoralized and underperforming. It happens so often. And I've probably seen it 100 times. And it's sad to see a project run downhill because of people's inability to see eye to eye on the project. So this is where it's important to introduce strong human resource skills and activities to build your team, to build morale. You need at the beginning, a strong recruitment process, and you need to exhibit strong leadership skills just to keep people moving forward positively throughout the project, because you're going to have ebbs and flows over 4 or 5 years, right? In some cases, you're going to have tough conversations as a project manager with each other, but you need to have respect throughout no matter what. And then we have our stakeholder management, and you've already talked a little bit about this in your exercises, just about managing relationships with everybody. And these can be all sorts of partners, externally, internally, and it depends on the type of project that you're running as well. So it depends on your preferences, your leadership style, how you include your external partners. Do you include them a lot or a little? And it involves the steps required to identify the people, these groups or organizations that could impact or be impacted by your project. Okay, so these stakeholders are really important. And if you look at this, I mentioned at the beginning, I was going to just show you the partnerships involved here. I've outlined the many different types of partners that a project could have. This isn't complete by any means, but it's quite a few of them. It's a huge list, right? And this isn't, you'll notice that there are a range of local partners. There's a range from community-based groups to churches to local authorities, advocacy groups, women's rights groups, children, youth groups. There's a local business sector there, service providers, vendors who are selling you stuff. And, the list goes on and on and on. And you have to map out these stakeholders when you start a project. And on the international side, there's multilaterals like the UN, there's government bodies, there's churches, universities, hospitals, corporations, again, the list goes on. And for a lot of organizations, they have internal stakeholders as well. And these could be their alliances like Care Alliance, the Plan International Alliance, World Vision International. Those are all alliances of national organizations. And it could be their memberships in different networks they belong to. Could be their ambassadors, their champions of their brand for fundraising and things like that. So there's just tons and tons that when you map it out, it's incredible how many people have touch points on these projects. So as a project manager, your ability to build relationships and establish those networks with a lot of these organizations can really add a huge, tremendous value to your work and to your success. So the projects that operate in a silo or in isolation very, very rarely, I would say, have huge success or are well integrated into the SDG process in a country. It's really hard to contribute to SDGs or like community poverty if you don't operate alongside key stakeholders, as we were talking earlier. You got to also find ones that have a similar mission to you, they have similar objectives to you as well to make that synergy happen. So in fact, you'll often see a section in donor proposals in those templates that ask you to identify other projects in the region that could impact your work. And you'll have to do your stakeholder mapping analysis. And most of you also brought this into your exercise last week. So you've already got a start in understanding how that all works. And then you got your information system. So that, briefly, this just includes the steps for overseeing the tools that you're using and your techniques, integrating, disseminating the outputs of your project management process. In general, it's the system that you put in place that helps in managing the information flow of your project and the data that you accumulate throughout the project lifecycle. So at the end of the day, while this is not going to impact your triple constraint terribly much, you can't succeed in a project without some form of data management. I talked about that earlier. And then you have your project risk management. And I've already discussed this quite a bit. And just remembering you have to identify and plan for the risks before implementing your project. And you can think of risk management as a cycle that's ongoing throughout your project cycle. So you work through the identification phase of the risks, then you assess the effect on the outcomes of your project, then you design your risk response, which is based on your assumptions and your predictions of what's going to happen. And then you assess your risks in terms of severity and likelihood of happening from that previous table. And then you report on how it's being handled. So the process is set up in the planning phase, but once you get into implementation, you'll be going through this cycle on a regular basis with your team. So it's usually every year or so, but it could be more frequent depending on, where you are, what context you're in, if it's a war zone or, high risk of disaster, that kind of thing. And then lastly, we have your project contract management. And this is about managing your donor agreement, the one that we signed, the charter. So as the project manager, you're responsible for keeping a copy of the agreement or charter in your top drawer at all times, and you're expected to know it inside and out. You're the only one in the project that's supposed to know every word and every paragraph. So any other agreements that you signed, any contracts with vendors, with partners, are all within your responsible area. So you ensure that the conditions of the contracts and the agreements are met and carried out correctly. So those are the key supportive processes, guys, that you'll have direct control over during the project management cycle, the core and the supporting. But just to finish up, I mentioned there are some other supportive processes as well. So I'll just show you that really quickly. And it's these ones here. So those are the key supportive processes, the other ones, and I won't spend a lot of time on these, but they're considered processes in which the project manager doesn't always have or usually have direct control, or he or she may have a touch point, but not entirely responsible for them. So basically, your home office or your headquarters is often very involved in some of these areas of the project, and they can override the project manager. So where you have ultimate CEO responsibility, in this case, they can override you on that. So that's just to give you an idea of what else there is there. And then I just want to wrap up because we have to finish. This is the closure phase. Okay, so the closure phase is probably the most problematic of our life cycle. And I've already mentioned how we forget to inform our community stakeholders, or how we've done and what the project's achieved. But unfortunately, project managers and other senior staff tend to start looking for jobs when we hit the 6-month finish line. And it's pretty natural. Agencies are always challenged to find ways to keep their staff right to the end of a project. So you're already losing a lot of your institutional memory from the project before you can report out and close effectively. So the closure of a project should technically be designed back in your planning phase. And you have what is called an exit strategy. That will include, you have a disposal plan for all your assets. You set up a means of accounting for all your purchases and assets in the offices. You need to close out all the agreements that you've signed with your vendors and your partners in the project. You need to bring in that high value data that your project's been tracking over the last few years. And very importantly, you need to transition all of your staff, the ones that are remaining. So the closure should be very much a part of your work breakdown structure at the get-go, and you should be able to plan much of it well in advance, almost when you start your project. Now, the problem is most agencies don't have time when they're setting up everything else because it's such a busy time at the very beginning of your project planning. So planning, while not particularly difficult in a sense, it's extremely time consuming. And so certain tasks like exit strategies and closing plans get left off, and they figure, well, we can do it later in the project. Problem is, a lot of people forget, and then they don't do it till the very end. So always good practice is do it as early in the project cycle as you can, so it's good to go, because the end creeps up on you real quick. And then I've illustrated just a few other critical activities that you need to make sure are put in place in your work breakdown structure. And you'll normally start that process of closing about 6 months to the end of your project. That's when you start to wind down your activities. So the idea is that you'll suddenly have a surge in activities around that time, and then gradually transition out most of your operations by the last several months. And then in the last 2 months, you're working on the final report, the data analysis, and that's pretty much it. You should only have a skeleton crew at the end, and they're basically just writing the final report. So I'm just going to end with this. If you guys give me a couple more minutes, because this is pretty critical, I just want to end with this little bit here. So we wind up the project management life cycle. I just want to show you how they all fit together in terms of a timeline. And it's a bit rough, but it'll give you an idea, and it's a nice visual for how it all sort of fits together. So you just see that the identification design phase is right at the start. and it's generally short. Okay, so this is within what we call the project cycle. It's not part of the project management cycle, project cycle. So because you generally don't have your manager on board. So the initiation phase, then this part here, is the start of the project management cycle officially, and it's where you get your charter and the agreement settled. So this line's a bit longer, but it just indicates that there can be amendments along the way. There can be changes that you can agree with your donor, so that could possibly go on throughout. Anything, remember, happening before the agreement or charter is signed is not covered under the funds given by your donor. So that's really important to remember. The planning phase, okay, here, it can start as early as the first day, depending on how confident you are about getting your project funding awarded. So I've had projects where we started the process right away since the donor had given us a verbal okay on the funding. But generally you would see planning starting about where the design phase stops. That would be generally what you would see. And then you have your implementation, this line here. And it is never started, remember, before the donor funds come in. However, some organizations, again, gray areas, right? They have existing structures in the field. They might want to carry out some activities on their own. So they'll put up their own funding for that, and that's perfectly fine. They just can't use the donor's fund at that point. And then the M&E function right here is obviously across all the phases of the all the way and the transition or closing phase at the end of the project. So sorry, that's a rough diagram, but it was a last minute attempt to really demonstrate how they all fit together and give you a visual. Okay, so that is it. It's 2 minutes over, but that is the project cycle